I just want to say a few words before we kick off around Panmure House. This has been a labour of love for Heriot-Watt University. It has been a phenomenal piece of work, and I'm really indebted to the various benefactors who have worked with us to refurbish, to develop it, to create it as a forum for critical thinking around the future of business and society, the future of capitalism, the shape of contemporary economy. It is a fantastic opportunity that we have developed to be that place of critical thinking. And there are a number of key strands to that. One of these is the Lights of Caledonia programme, which has been generously supported by the Friends of Panmure House. So to the Friends of Panmure House, thank you very, very much for supporting it. And the Lights of Caledonia is a programme of events that is designed to flag up, designed to highlight the intellectual and cultural contribution that Scotland has made to the wider world. And Panmure House is very much somewhere of Scotland, but very much for the world. And tonight, in many ways, is a particularly special event because it's about Adam Smith himself. And we really are delighted to have one of his leading biographers here tonight to talk about, to reflect on Adam Smith, and that is Jesse Norman. Jesse, as many of you will be aware, has been a Member of Parliament since 2010. He has served in various government roles, including Financial Secretary to the Treasury during the COVID period, which I'm sure we can all agree was an interesting challenge. He has served beyond the Treasury in the Department of Transport and the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Society. But one of the, I think we all can probably agree, one of the curses of modern society is the professional politician, the politician who has not had a life before politics. I'm pleased that Jesse has had a life before politics. He was a director of Barclays Bank. He taught philosophy at UCL, and he ran a charitable foundation in Eastern Europe. So a really deep hinterland, and that deep hinterland is reflected in the work that he has written around Smith and Burke, amongst others. He's a graduate of Oxford and UCL, and I'm really delighted to welcome Jesse to the stage this evening. Jesse.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Angus, for that extremely generous opening set of remarks. And thank you all, ladies and gentlemen, for coming along to this glorious place. This is, in fact, my third visit to Panmure House. I came first when it was still being rebuilt. I came again when it had been rebuilt, and now I see it in its absolute finery, and I couldn't be more thrilled and delighted. And I couldn't be more cognizant of the enormous effort and hard work that have gone into it by many people. I won't embarrass them by mentioning Heather McGregor or Caroline Howitt or others, but it has been an incredible labour of love, astonishing amount of hard work, and also work that has been supported by the Edinburgh financial community more widely in a very generous and enduring way. And I thank all of them very much for this. It would be quite wrong of me not to say a few words in memory of my great friend, a great friend of all of you, and a man who should have been here this evening, Angus Grossart. And Angus, a great Smithian in his own right, a man who became a friend of mine because he liked my book and called me up in his classic, what should I say, unembarrassed, strong, almost Mediterranean way, and we love him for it. I wish he were here now, and if I had a glass of something appropriate, I would be raising it in his honour, his memory now. So thank you all so much. It's such an honour to be able to speak about Smith. It's such an honour to do so in this extraordinarily special place, and it's such an honour to do so on the eve of Adam Smith's 300th anniversary. And if we think of his anniversary as coming from his moment of birth, that is June 1723, then we are coming up to the beginning of that 12-month period around his birth. And I know it's going to be, the tercentenarian is going to be a fantastic celebration in this city, and I suspect around the world. Now, I want to focus today, however, not just on Smith himself, indeed not just on his ideas, but on what has happened to those ideas since his death, and to explore a little bit with you why and how they remain so amazingly relevant to our present world. Well, what is that world? Our world of social media, our world of celebrity culture, of allegedly woke thinking, Google, Apple, Facebook, trade wars, and indeed real war, European war. The incredible fact is that even after 3 centuries, Adam Smith remains the best guide one could think of to considering, to reflecting, and to exploring these things. Now, let me start by offering a disclaimer. I am, in fact, a Minister of the Foreign Office at the moment. I'm here sub-fusk in Mufti. My brief covers the Americas, trade and security. That's about as Smithian a combination as you could possibly imagine. It's quite ironic. But I am going to suggest, as I've said, that Smith offers us a treasure trove of wisdom. But I should be clear that I am speaking today not as someone in politics. I've got no axe to grind of any kind. I'm only speaking with a semi-academic hat on, as someone with an interest in history and philosophy. And perhaps that's just as well, because, as you may recall, Adam Smith memorably denounced what he called that insidious and crafty animal, vulgarly called a statesman or politician, whose counsels are directed by the momentary fluctuations of affairs. How very different things are now from the late 18th century, when he used those words in relation to trade wars in The Wealth of Nations. Just one area in which his thought remains absolutely seminal. So today, as you will be aware, we all admire and respect this man, but there are parts of the world in which the message has not perhaps fully got through. Perhaps the truth about Adam Smith has not genuinely percolated. There is a sense amongst some, particularly in parts some way west of here, that Smith is really, should be considered an advocate of laissez-faire, a staunch, not only the staunch proponent of the invisible hand and the freedom of the individual, but also the staunch enemy of state intervention, and therefore someone to be celebrated as a libertarian in a world released from the utopian delusions of communism and socialism. On the other hand, and sometimes on the other side of the political spectrum, there are people who think of Smith in a very different way, as the true source and origin of what's come to be known as market fundamentalism, Homo economicus, the efficient market hypothesis, author of, quote, the textbook on contemporary capitalism, and the prime mover of a materialist ideology sweeping the world and corrupting real sources of human value. And not only that, but an apologist for wealth and inequality and human selfishness, and a misogynist to boot. So these are caricatures that have arisen in different ways about Smith. And part of my job in writing, as I have done, and perhaps a little in speaking today, is to try to see beyond those caricatures, to explode them, to get to what's really going on, and to try to give us, in Panmure House, in front of his portrait, a sense of what the real Adam Smith was like, so that we can go out and spread the word to others. Now, as for me, I came to Smith for the first time, well, not for the first time, I suppose I was much younger, but I came back to him through my book on Edmund Burke. And as you may know, the two men admired each other very well, and they became close friends towards the end of their lives. They were not quite contemporaries, but almost. And Smith was reported as saying, and I don't see any reason why this shouldn't be true, although there's been some pushback in the academic literature, sorry to tell you, that Burke is the only man I ever knew who thinks on economic subjects exactly as I do, without any previous communication having passed between us. Now, it's often the way, as you will be aware, that outsiders have the greatest insight into society. That's a handsome tribute, isn't it? Thinks on economic subjects exactly as I do, without any previous communication having passed between us. Remarkable thing for a person of his eminence and genius to say about another. And what Smith and Burke have in common in their own backgrounds is that they were not English. Burke was an Irishman. Smith was a Scot. Both rose through sheer ability to positions of international eminence in their own lifetime at a time when the Irish and the Scots were widely scorned in England. When Burke came to England, it was widely assumed that an Irishman on the make was after your fortune or your daughter. And when Smith came to his maturity, there was a great deal there was Scotophobia in England, as you may be aware. Both came to advise prime ministers, Marquess of Rockingham and William Pitt the Younger, respectively. And there's this marvellous story you may know, and I don't apologise for saying it again because it's such a lovely story, of a meeting attended by Pitt and many of the great figures of the age, including Dundas and Addington, Wilberforce, Grenville, and Smith, one of the last guests to arrive, and when he entered the room, the whole company rose from their seats to receive him and remained standing. "Be seated, gentlemen," said Smith. "No, no, no," replied Pitt. "We will stand till you are first seated, for we are all your scholars." And of course, both Burke and Smith wrote books that utterly transformed our understanding of human affairs. If you want to understand, if you really want to get inside this extraordinarily modern set of ideas, ideology, revolution, extremism, the idea of an institution, representative government, political parties, constitutional democracy, every single one of those matters, a burning issue of the day today, then you should read Edmund Burke. There has been no finer writer on these topics than Burke. If you want to understand markets, free trade, economics, crony capitalism, rent extraction, the origins and nature of inequality, power, property, moral, social norms, the creation of human culture, read Adam Smith. Of course, if you want to cheat, you can read my books. But I hope you'll be excited, if you do, to go on from them and read the originals, because both are marvellous writers as well as extraordinary thinkers. Now, I thought, I didn't do a degree in economics. I kind of came to political economy relatively later in life. But I actually thought I knew something about Adam Smith when I first engaged on that project. And virtually everything I thought I knew turned out to be wrong, which is an interesting experience. And what I discovered was that it was just the tip of a much wider whole, an entire and still in many ways largely undiscovered continent of thought. So take the theory of trade, for example. So friends and foes alike standardly think of Adam Smith as the great advocate of free trade, and so he is. But let me just give you a list of state interventions in markets and in free trade that Smith is willing to support. The Navigation Acts, requiring all trade to be carried in English ships manned by English crews, or British ships managed by British crews. Taxing spirits more than beer to reduce the consumption of alcohol. The granting of temporary monopolies to stimulate overseas trade in remote or hostile regions. A duty in law to pay workers in cash rather than in kind as a protection against fraud. Higher taxes on rents in kind than on money rents. The compulsory registration of mortgages. Enforcement of building standards, sterling marks on silver plates, stamps on textiles to show their quality. Special regulation of the banks and of currency. There's an idea there somewhere, I'm sure. And even a 5% limit on the maximum rate of interest as a protection against the wasteful activities of prodigals and projectors. So Smith's views are vastly more nuanced and sophisticated than people, whether friends or foes, really understand. Now, as you will know, I'm not going to recap Smith's life, not least because it was extraordinarily uneventful. He never married, he had no children. As far as we know, there were no secret loves. no hidden vices, no undergraduate pranks, no adult peccadillos. When it comes to juicy personal detail, Smith's life is a featureless Sahara. But if his life was uneventful, the times he lived in were absolutely not. They were tumultuous. And of course, to write about Smith is to write about the times. And I think of the, I'm not going to take a political position, ladies and gentlemen, in this room above all on this occasion. But it would be wrong, historically inaccurate and inept of me not to note that the Act of Union between England and Scotland in 1707 was a still, by Smith's, in the middle of Smith's lifetime, a subject of serious political debate and tremendous arguments on both sides of the question. And Smith himself was in, as you may know, in no doubt that it was the foundation of Scotland's, both Scotland's nationhood and its economic success. As indeed, those were the views of all of the major thinkers of the Scottish Enlightenment. In Smith's words, it was a measure from which infinite good has been derived to this country, a fact that I have found, a quote that I found extraordinarily helpful in the House of Commons in dealing with some of my Scottish nationalist colleagues on the other side of the House. There are also the Jacobite rebellions, of course, at that time, the rebellion of 1745, and one forgets, and certainly the English forget, how close Bonnie Prince Charlie and the Highlanders came to winning that rebellion. They came within 120 miles of London. They got to Derby, and they might have gone on and taken the city, which was undefended, if they had not been tricked by false English intelligence. There's a lesson there as well, I'm afraid. And then, of course, there's the 7 Years' War of 1756 to 1763, truly the First World War, in which this country fought and defeated the French across 4 continents from Boston to Bengal, averting a French invasion across the Channel, and laying the foundations for good and for ill, important to note, of what later became the British Empire. Now, even that war in its own time was controversial. Its debts were so ruinous that they pushed Britain into the loss of its American colonies and ultimately into the war, in the War of Independence. And of course, they also pushed France into the debt crisis that ultimately manifested itself in the French Revolution. And of course, this is also a time of the Scottish Enlightenment, that incredible moment when Scotland transformed itself, not merely economically, but in cultural and intellectual terms, from the edge to the centre of European thought. Imagine a country going from being a solid performer in the English Premiership to being Manchester City and Real Madrid combined. That we're talking about staggering transformation. And it's incredible to think that that was accompanied by this dazzling array of talent, including not just Smith, but Hume, Ferguson, Hutton, Miller, Robertson, Hugh Blair, and others. And what is so joyous to me about that process was not just the incredible intellects and the intellectual contributions that these people made, but the equalizing spirit and the commitment to improvement that lay, and if I may say so, the open to all nature of the revolution, intellectual revolution that they created in ways that I think equal and arguably supersede and exceed the astonishing generation of Dr. Johnson, Reynolds, Garrick, Burke, Goldsmith, Gibbon, and the rest of them in London. And of course, Hume and Smith were at the centre of that process, and it's astonishing to think of them, this incredible combination, the kind of reserved Smith and the open, witty, gourmand David Hume. And it's very much to Smith's credit that I think he took Hume's ideas as seriously as he did and elaborated them and energized them as he did. And it's enormously to Hume's credit that he was able to find in Smith so thoughtful and brilliant an interpreter. Now, what's going on when these two men, what if we imagine they saw each other remarkably little for, given the amount of the depth of their friendship and intellectual engagement, but what were they up to, and why does it matter now? So the first thing to say is that they are thinking about the world in engaged, enlarged, expansive ways that we do not always recognize and we do not often see today. Very often today, people are nitpicking around the edges of society, and what you get is quickly published, underthought through, bombastic claims to kind of academic preeminence. That's not what we're talking about. I don't need to tell you, someone who was slow to publish as Adam Smith, the last thing you would ever do is to say that this work was ill-digested or under-considered. And ditto with Hume. What are they doing? It's the Great Enlightenment Project. The idea of setting out a science of man, of being a Newton, not just for physics and cosmology, but for human life in all its aspects. Taking a few basic propositions and then expanding that, recursively elaborating it into a whole understanding of philosophy, religion, political economy, jurisprudence, the arts, the sciences, even language itself. And those ideas in turn able to form and act as the basis for every other branch of human knowledge. The science, this idea of a science of man. And a science to be based not on the unaided functioning of the intellect, but on observation and experience. And not on natural law, divine inspiration, or religious dogma, but on an acute sense of the limitations of human reason as well as its powers. And so this is thinking that looks to the horizon. This is big philosophy, big ideas. And for Smith, the crucial idea is this sense of exchange. The exchange that we know of best of all as the exchange of goods and services in the wealth of nations, and the operation of markets and of mutual benefit that comes from free exchange and trade. But what's so fascinating when you get back into Smith, including the unpublished works, the lectures on jurisprudence and the lectures on rhetoric and belles lettres in particular, is how he elaborates and generalizes this idea of exchange, so that he's thinking not just about the exchange of goods and services, he's thinking about the exchange of meanings in language. He's thinking about the exchange of ideas between minds, almost a shared mind as ideas come to be enjoyed by individuals and communities at once. And he's thinking about the exchange of regard in the formation of our moral and social norms and the theory of moral sentiments. Now, I could bore you to death on any of these topics, and I'm not going to do that tonight, you'll be pleased to know. But I do want to take the most well-known example and just expand it a little bit and talk a little bit about what it might mean to us in itself and then as an expression of this idea of exchange. That's the first place I suppose we come to it is the first place we naturally think of Smith these days, which is with his second book, The Wealth of Nations. And that is a work which you know is one of inextinguishable genius. And not merely because it sets out those central intellectual tools of political economy in the context of this crucial idea of exchange. Ideas like the division of labour, of market equilibrium, the effects of incentives on human behaviour, the benefits of free trade, the proper principles of taxation, just to list a few. But because Smith makes a move that none of his predecessors in political economy had made before. And there was a very substantial literature in political economy. I don't need to tell you, James Stewart most recently before Smith, but also Cantillon, John Law, Petty, a vast array of thought in econometrics and in political economy, or what we might think of as aspects of political economy. No, the big move that Smith makes is the exchange idea. He takes this idea of a market and puts it right at the centre of political economy. And that's the move that makes Smith the hinge of our modern concept of economics and political economy, in a way that Burke is the hinge for the ideas of political parties, representative government, and the duties of an elected representative. So that move is what anchors Smith's most enduring, in my view, claim to immortality in our thinking. Now, when you absorb that, when you think in those ways, what does that do to our understanding of those caricatures that I mentioned earlier on? Well, first of all, it explodes them. You know, Smith was not an economist in the sense that we would think of it. He was more a philosopher than an economist. He was not an advocate of laissez-faire. The invisible hand only occurs once in the Welsh of Nations. He didn't just have a single specific theory of markets, and he did not oppose all state interventions, as I've described. He didn't think selfishness was a virtue, and he was not a misogynist. He would have been an opponent of the modern idea of market fundamentalism and homo economicus and the efficient market hypothesis in the way they have been regarded as somehow generalizing assumptions about human behavior, and which, in my view, badly distort his views. Now, in the 150 years after his death, roughly speaking, 1790, well, in fact, almost 200 years, Smith's ideas went through a progressive process of being, first of all, ignored, and then beginning to be absorbed, and steadily, under the influence of mathematical achievements, in particular the so-called Marginist Revolution, a further caricature of Smith emerged as essentially the founder not of political economy, but of a very mathematized economics. Now, that is a very significant intellectual achievement in its own right, and I would be the last person to decry that as an achievement. But it is extremely limited in ways that its protagonists often underestimate. And it is limited also because it specifically fails to understand things that Smith takes as foundational aspects of his view and that he will not give up. So Smith doesn't think that markets are disembodied mathematical constructs of modern economics. He thinks they are living institutions embedded in specific cultures and mediated by norms and trust, and norms indeed that he set out a theory of in the Theory of Moral Sentiments. He thinks of them as dynamic and evolving. He thinks of them as having common features but as different from one another as individuals are from each other. And so it's an incredible mistake from a Smithian perspective to confuse the markets for land or labour or capital, or even within the capital markets to confuse debt markets with equity markets or product markets in their first instance from resale markets and all the rest of them. These are just, each of these has a general treatment but then requires specific elaboration and investigation, and one needs to be very caveated in one's understanding of how these markets work. And it's a failure to understand that. So take the energy market. One of the reasons why energy policy has been so fraught over the last few years is because arguably the regulators spent too much time thinking of it in spot market terms borrowed from the financial sector rather than in terms of the norms of trust and institutional stability that we would naturally come to associate. So they prioritized cost savings from that perspective rather than what we would consider the embedded longevity of arguably a more Smithian approach to regulation. So those things we need to correct when we think about Smith now, and we also need to correct the idea that markets and the market order do not rely on the state. And finally, because of course they patently do in many ways that I've already mentioned. And finally, we need to correct the assumption that capitalism, in its modern sense, was something that Smith knew about, discussed, or advocated. It never arose, as you may know. It didn't develop until 60-odd years after the publication of The Wealth of Nations, when you had the emergence of private corporations as autonomous pools of capital. And Smith was a very vigorous opponent of the crony capitalism of his own day, as you may know. Indeed, for Smith, what matters is not capitalism in any sense, which is ultimately an idea deriving from Marx, but what he called commercial society. And that commerce is not merely economic commerce, and that society has just as much weight as the commercial in the phrase. Because that society, that concept of society, is one in which the freedoms it offers, not merely to buy and sell and to live, are offered to everyone in their own right and without subordination to others. Okay. I said at the beginning of the talk that Smith's ideas remain amazingly relevant to our present world. Let me just touch on some modern phenomena that they help to explain. So, crony capitalism and much of the theory of rent seeking and rent extraction. The idea of ownership properly exercised, and the principal agent problem, which is broadly speaking that we empower people to act on our behalf and then they run off with our money rather than jealously guarding our interests. The impact of materialism, our obsession with what Smith calls trinkets of frivolous utility. Celebrity culture, or what he calls the civility that inclines us to adore our superiors and trample underfoot our inferiors. Virtue signalling, or the feigned exchange of moral regard. The ancient danger of societies being softened by wealth and luxury, and the importance of maintaining and respecting martial vigour. Now there's a thought we might reflect on in the context of a European war at the present time. And that's just to be getting on with. Let me develop that final thought with one last provocation. When Russia launched its illegal and unprovoked invasion of Ukraine, what was the response? In the first place, it was condemned in the UN General Assembly by a resolution signed by 141 nations. Literally yesterday, that resolution was accompanied by a second resolution condemning the sham referenda signed by 143 nations. The UK, the US, the EU and others have put in a raft of economic sanctions. International companies and iconic consumer brands have disinvested from Russia. Organizations judged to be abetting the Russian war effort have been shunned, ignored, and legally prevented from getting goods and services that they seek. Russian banks have been denied access to SWIFT, the international bank payment system. Oligarchs and other persons of interest have been designated for travel bans and asset freezes and denied credit. Yachts have been impounded, football clubs have been sold. That is commercial society of the world turning its back on an aggressor who would ignore its norms and its expectations. In other words, alongside the military support that has been offered to Ukraine, the world's leading commercial societies have rejected not just President Putin and his cronies, but what they stand for. And they have done so not just economically, but morally and socially. No more Smithian response could be imagined, I put it to you. And that global response continues to show astonishing resilience. May it continue to do so. Thank you very much indeed.
Jesse, I'm sure I speak for everyone in expressing real thanks for that stimulating tour de force through Smith's life and much of Smith's thinking. And in all of these fora, it's the conversation that follows that's the really valuable part. And I'm looking forward to vibrant discussion from the floor. And I know from our previous conversation you are as well. You get very few perks from chairing a forum, but the one that you do get is to ask the first question. And I really just want to push a little bit further on where you were taking us to at the end, bringing Smith into the contemporary world. What insights do you think Smith would offer us in terms of looking at solutions to some of those great societal challenges that we face, a transitioning economy, environmental degradation,
Yes.
inequality? What do you think he offers us particularly that would be interesting in shaping our thinking, in trying to make that world a better place?
Well, thank you, Angus, for that. Let's pick up some of the challenges that you've just mentioned. So, obviously, we as a world are concerned about climate change, concerned about environmental degradation. And you might think, well, environmental economics didn't exist in Smith's time, and this is not a topic on which he has anything much to say. But I do think that the core insight of his political economy, which is that markets are the most efficient and effective way, and also in many ways the most socially equitable way of allocating goods and of imposing costs, but that they have to be designed because they are different from each other. We cannot simply open the floodgates in some sense because that's often what's created an environmental problem in the first place. The embedded costs that are not reflected in the price of something. Those insights, both as diagnosis and as cure, I think are incredibly valuable. Now, many years ago, when I was running a charity in Eastern Europe, it was during the communist period, giving away medical textbooks and setting up free institutions. It was my way of fighting communism, and in a very small way. But of course, these were doctors who did not have access to modern medical science. So it was valuable. But those were societies in which the fact that environmental activity and industrial activity was not properly priced led to incredible degradation. The most famous example, one of the most famous examples in Europe was the aluminium smelting works in Katowice near Krakow in Poland, which because the mantra was produce aluminium at all costs, and the inputs of nature were regarded as costless and unrepresentative, and therefore it's only when you start to bring those into... So what does that mean now? It means two things. One is get your costs right, but also don't throw away the idea of markets as highly efficient, effective, innovation-generating means to solve environmental as well as economic problems. I think that's the kind of area in which I think we find a lot from Smith.
Great, thank you. Can I open up to the floor for questions? Do we have anyone who would like to pose a suitable challenge to Jesse on Adam Smith's thinking?
You may need to abuse the privilege again of being chair, Angus, unless we have a brave spirit. Yes, sir.
You touched laterally on the principal agent kind of problem, and yeah, Adam Smith's definitely credited as one of the earliest people who identified that kind of fundamental problem, and seeing that a lot of kind of firm failure can be attributed to a basic corporate governance failures in corporate governance.
Yes.
What would you say Adam Smith what would be his elaborated answer on that principal agent model? Do you think that there's a solution in stakeholder theory, or is it more with a solution more aligned with like Friedman, who claims that the sole purpose of a business is to maximise profits, and also in terms of trying to tackle climate change, where's the solution to that basic problem?
I mean, you'll recall that Friedman published a famous article saying the social responsibility of businesses is to maximise profits. And that's never been, by the way, for what it is worth, just detail point, that's never been the law in this country. And it's an improper understanding of the law in this country. The law in this country is not that corporations should be run exclusively in the interest of their shareholders. It is that the shareholders are entitled to the residue when all the other claims have been met. And those are subtly different things. And in British law, corporations are expected to act for the benefit of their members, which is not just their shareholders. So I think we have a rather more nuanced view than is sometimes understood by people who would read capitalism across back to this country from America. So we can't be absolutely clear where Smith would have come out, and he's the prescient point is about identifying the problem. And if you, as you sound like you may have done, spend a lot of time thinking about corporate governance, you will know that an awful lot of putative ideas have turned out to be subject themselves to all kinds of gaming and abuse. So many years ago, I helped set up a business called Institutional Shareholder Services, which was the first business advising pension funds on how to vote their shares. This was in America. And we thought that the alignment of voting rights with pension funds would lead to a long-term focus on the ownership of businesses that would be extremely beneficial. Okay, well, that's turned out not to be true. What's happened has been that, first of all, pension funds became much less important in the relative to as owners than mutual funds and hedge funds in a way that we hadn't anticipated. The second is that it turned out that the people who owned the equity which was being granted in the form of options often had different attitudes based on the options that were granted from the ones they would have had if they'd brassed up their own money in a proper Smithian way for this. And by the way, they took a bath from time to time if the options went out of the value, and they were able to make that argument. And of course, it often meant that they banked staggering amounts of money, which removed any actual incentive to the long-term development. So my own view is that the distinctive, and there are other abuses that I could point to, but the distinctive Smithian move is not just to think of a company as a nexus of contracts, and not even just to think of it as not merely an economically but a legally embedded entity. It's to think of that third part of that third pillar of the functioning of companies, which is culture, and the way in which culture is itself spread normatively through a company. And I think you have to get all those three right, and not just and no one of them can be pulling too hard against the others, because people tend to abuse the one that favours them. And I think that would be the Smithian response, a slightly more generalised approach, but I think that's the direction he would be coming in.
Great, thank you. We had a question, I think, yeah.
Smith was obviously well ahead of his time, and that's probably a huge understatement. I think I know the answer to this, but I'll ask the question anyway. Notwithstanding the most recent events, what do you think would be his assessment of the progress that we've made?
Of the progress?
Yeah, as a society.
Well, that's a big question. I mean, I'll tell you a book that Smith might have enjoyed. Who can know what would be the case 300 years later? But a book that Smith might have enjoyed would be the Better Angels of Our Nature by Steve Pinker, and that is a book. And there's quite a substantial literature before that, but that's a book that's brought into modern, as it were, political economy and sociological discourse, basically an understanding of how violence has evolved over time in different ways through societies. And it's astonishing. So one of its conclusions, completely counterintuitively, is that the 20th century was the least violent century we've ever had. Completely not what we think, right? We think of barbaric incidents, we think of Holocaust, we think of, world wars, but actually, when Hobbes talks about life being solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short, this isn't just a definition. His description of what it would be like in a state of nature is not a bad description of, parts of 17th century England, and England was a very law-abiding place compared to the rest of the world. So. I think when you look at it in those terms, the kind of hyper-macro terms, Smith would think actually that commercial society had evolved. He offers an evolutionary theory, as you know, of development, stadial theory, 3 stages, but he would have thought of the commercial society itself as having evolved, I think. And I also think he would he would have warned us against being too parochial in another way. So one way we can be parochial is we can just say, well, hold on a second, we can see lots of death, therefore this last century must have been a very high death century. Another way we can be parochial is we can say to ourselves, we see inequality in our own society, okay, but what we don't see is how the rest of the world is equalizing. And so if you take a global lens on it, and you have to hold one's analytical interest, brackets, worry, concern about inequality within this society or the US or other countries. But you look at a global picture, and the picture is very much one of equalization. I think he'd be very excited about that, and I think he'd very quietly, be a feeling of, that's largely a market-based activity. And of course, a lot of it's due to China. And the fact that China has gone down this market-based communism approach, and the energy that's been unleashed by that, and the innovation has its frightening aspects, but it's also liberated economically in prosperity, hundreds of millions of people.
Thank you very much. Can I go over there and then over here?
Can I ask, do you know if he read Voltaire? Did he have any ideas about Voltaire, Adam Smith?
Well, not only did Smith read Voltaire, everyone read Voltaire, if I may say so, and Smith was very widely read. Not only did Smith read Voltaire, but he accompanied the Duke of Buccleuch on a European tour which involved a visit to Toulouse just after the death of Jean Calas, who was a man a Huguenot, wrongly accused of killing his own son, and butchered and racked and left out to die in the sun. And Calas made an enormous and Voltaire made enormous fuss about the Calas case. It became a huge cause célèbre, and Voltaire had the whole thing reversed, and it was an incredible. And Voltaire was egomaniac sans pareil, and but saw an opportunity to do good as well as get his own name back on the front pages, and so Smith came and was working and living in Toulouse when they were still wrestling with the impact of that. And so that reflection on that incident and on the capacity of human beings to react in that way, inspired by religion, inspired by, that's very, very much in Smith's mind in his later in his later work. It happened in 1763, so anything in the last 25 years of his life really will have had that thinking in particular behind it. It's worth just saying one other thing, which is, you may know there's this disagreement about religion between Hume and Smith. So Smith's idea of religion is a very kind of marketistic type idea. So Smith's view is, very broadly speaking, you do not have a state endorsed, sponsored, or otherwise, as it were, enfranchised religion. Religions are just sects who duke it out in as it were, the marketplace of ideas, and that was enormously influential in America and other places. And Hume has the opposite view. Hume says, no, you don't understand, and maybe you didn't get the memo. Says Hume. I'm paraphrasing slightly. He says the whole point is that religion is a source of enthusiasm and terrible ill feeling, and the joy of state sponsorship of anything is that it has the effect of enervating it and reducing its energy and ultimately potentially killing it. And therefore a state religion is a vital thing, because that will suck all of the aberrant and angry energy out of religious intolerance. And I've always thought that was a rather amusing idea of Hume's, and I've always had to give sympathy for it as well.
Yes, I like the lack of connection between, what is and what ought to be in Hume.
Yes.
I think that's a terrible sort of cataclysmic change in people's ideas.
You mean that we think that from a sentence, from a factual sentence, a description, you can somehow automatically reach a moral judgment. So if you say people with this socioeconomic or ethnic background do less well in school than others, on your view, not necessarily controversially or uncontroversially, that in and of itself carries no policy prescription. That's just a fact. And science has to be considered, and factual statements have to be considered in those terms. Yeah, I mean, it's
Chris Voltaire had the answer to that.
I'm not going to comment on that. I think that takes me beyond any area of expertise I might have.
Great, thank you very much. I saw we had a question over here.
Professor.
Yes. So I have a question that goes, it's about us here in the West, but I want to go via China. So you mentioned at the beginning that talking about culture, talking about the power of platform internet companies like Google and Facebook, celebrity culture, which I think most of us would agree is detrimental to many youth and even
Non-celebrities tend to take that view.
we're increasingly controlled by these internet companies and so on and so forth. Now let's look at what China is doing, right? So you mentioned just now that China, and I'm glad you mentioned it because I was going to ask you, so the big 20th century success story has been the Chinese Communist Party, who has embraced markets. Now, in a week's time, Xi will be chairman for life.
Yep.
He's been cracking down, we know that. But the interesting thing is that they've still embraced markets, but the control that they have over these internet companies and the regulations that they're putting in about, say, private schools and tutors, and this is one example I'm thinking of that is causing social unrest, as it were. Now, the Chinese will say, well, we're doing this because of the social unrest, the unattainable kind of expectations that people can't have the good life, they can't move up. And so we're tamping down, we're pulling all these things that Smith, I think, would agree are caustic to social cohesion, to the individual even. And I'm wondering how then do we in the West respond in a similar fashion? Now that the Chinese is a big hammer, what do we do?
It's a good Panmure House question. Let me say a couple of things about that. I have to be a little bit careful at what I say for obvious reasons, but let me try to engage the point you're making. So you're making several points, and I think they're all very interesting. So I think there's a misunderstanding in the West about the extent to which the Chinese view of the world is not just different from the one that we think of, paraphrased as the rules-based order of liberal democracies, but is a huge challenge to it. And the kind of fond liberal assumption is that, well, these people don't share our values and therefore we can ignore them. And in fact, I think the mistake there is we can ignore them intellectually. So the view that is being taken is that actually the long-term good of a society is a function of a process of social cohesion with Chinese characteristics, which is intrinsically less wasteful and less short-term and ultimately more rewarding to the people who participate in it. And that on that basis, decisions can be taken, which are not necessarily ones that in that short-term world would have been taken by those people had they been consulted. Now, I don't think we've begun to take that view seriously enough intellectually. And until we do that, we're going to continue to misunderstand what is going on. So I'm quite reluctant to kind of rush to judgment in that area. I think it is not just an actual challenge in many different ways, but potentially quite a severe intellectual challenge. And I think it's really important that when we talk about these ideas in Panmure House, Adam Smith's own house, we're talking about them in as rich and engaged and socially inclusive and long-term a way as we can, precisely in order to be able to rebut some of this tacit and often explicit critique. So that is why work done in this building and work done in the name of Smith and in this building has the potential to be extraordinarily important.
Thank you. Question from Jane. Did Smith have a view on the relationship between profitability and humanity?
I mean, I think Smith's view is that returns made by open and free competition in markets are less likely to be productive of, as it were, unfairness and inequality than returns made in cronyistic, politically overdetermined, under-competitive markets. He would, I think, have recognized that in some markets the rate of profit can be so low that inhumane behavior can be the result. He was a scathing critic of slavery, as you may know. He was a critic of slavery in the 1750s, you know, when Wilberforce and Clarkson didn't get going until the late 1780s. Okay, that's a fact we kind of forget. And he didn't just make a moral argument against slavery, he made an economic argument against slavery. Now, people have contested whether that economic argument is right or wrong. That's a much contested academic matter. But it is a notable fact that he is not restricting himself to one form of argument in his vigorous opposition to that. And I think that stands for not just his values, but also his sense of the possibility that markets can be very abusive if they are set up and incorrectly, as it were, allowed to arise. And that's why I think that's one of the things that fuels his tremendous indignation in that area, and I think he deserves our respect for it.
Okay, I just thought the idea, what Smith was saying, was that the slaves would work better if they paid. He didn't say you shouldn't have slaves.
Well, I think his thought is it's not slavery if you're not doing all of the things that respect an individual who's earning an income. So I think his assumption going alongside that is not we're retaining this behavior unattached, but that the abusive behavior is something that is curbed in the act of recognizing someone as a human being and giving them an opportunity to work. Now, of course, he hadn't seen what you might call the sharecropper experience of the 19th century. And if he had, he might have been much more nuanced about the extent to which you could take a slave context and replace it with a notionally paid context. But I think that was his position.
Thank you. Sandy.
I wondered if you could develop the themes of perhaps the last two questions, where there are huge benefits to society, to humanity, with longer term thinking. But many of the incentives, and you gave a regulatory example in your book, are in the short term or in the spot market, as you described it.
Quite.
How do you think he challenged us to move those incentives into that longer term thinking, which is genuinely a benefit, but we don't seem to be managing to achieve it all the time?
I mean, I suppose the trouble is not that we don't necessarily have a sense of how to do the right thing. It is that we start from a place where the embedded incentives to do the wrong thing are extraordinarily hard to shift. Short-termism in equity markets, for example. Short-termism in company managements hitting quarterly forecasts, where there is a marked difference in behavior between publicly quoted companies and privately held companies. So we can get a broad sense of the comparators in those cases. And then, of course, the other side is where people have a view which just turns out to be an incorrect view of what a market should look like, or what an approach should be to regulation. And I was picking up the point because, in a way, a false ideology is more dangerous than the alternative. But as you know, a great Scotsman, John Kay, did a lot of work on how you stop short-termism in equity markets, and he hasn't quite had the support either from industry or from government that he might have deserved. And of course, the benefits of that of that approach are ones which are intrinsically hard to put your finger on in the short term, because they are all about massive changes of behaviour that come from a much more structural and systematic change. Now, my standard line in this area, excuse me, I think it captures something, is to contrast the difference between the Americans, the Germans and the Brits. The Americans say, and this is, I hope you'll understand, broad caricature, look, this business is worth 10 million bucks, but my next business is worth 100 million bucks. Okay, and Germans say, broad caricature, this business is worth 10 million euros, but when my grandchildren own it, it'll be worth 100 million euros. And the Brit says, this business is worth 3 million quid, I'm selling it and going to live in Gloucestershire. Does that strike a chord?
Great, thank you for that. We have a question over here.
Thank you. So many questions, but there's not enough time to ask them all. You spoke of all of the ways in which Adam Smith has been misinterpreted, that he didn't intend for there to be laissez-faire markets.
Sure.
What do you think, in your view, would need to shift and change for the world to reflect his intentions?
I do think that, I mean, I would say this, wouldn't I? But I do think politicians can make a difference. And there are examples of, you know, just highly effective interventions and long-term thinking. And, you know, we should be, you know, the Brits as a whole should I think, not downplay their own ability. When it comes to building institutions, we are absolutely world class. And when it comes to understanding construction, let me give you a little example. It's quite pregnant at the moment. So George Osborne set up the Office of Budget Responsibility, right, to mark the scorecard of politicians so that they would have to operate within a fiscal framework that they had not decided, as it were, the outcomes of which, or the analysis of which they had not decided themselves. Okay, that turned out to be an extraordinarily useful thing. It didn't cost very much money, the thing, but just the action of saying, you Treasury guys don't get to choose, as it were, what the outlook is when you come to make fiscal policy. That's a very, very smart long-term piece of thinking, and I don't think we should be. I think we should be extremely proud of that. It's kind of painful in the short term, but that's the point of it, right? So there are plenty of other cases where we could, with continued attention, and by the way, let's take some other examples. So when I was at Department for Energy, we designed a series of subsidies for renewables. And the effect of that was that offshore wind went from costing us 120 quid I forget what it is, megawatt hour, to costing us, well, now it's about 30. So it depends how you count it. Falling fast. To give another example of markets which weren't designed, that was a designed market. Markets that are much less well designed. Photovoltaic cells, now cost, price has fallen by 99% over 40 years. So I personally think in the longer term, we're looking at a world of energy glut, because we've got so many different ways of turning wind power and sun power into energy. Now we've got to get over an interregnum period where we manage that, but those technology gains are fantastic.
Do you have you said you've got multiple questions. Do you?
Oh, no.
I'll give you the offer of a follow-on.
No, I would listen to you speak all night about all the different areas. I have one in particular, which is everyone focuses on the wealth of nations, and that's
Yes.
not my favourite book. Right?
Yep.
Theory of Moral Sentiments is arguably the much better book. I wondered if you had some thoughts that you wish wish to share on why that book has been the lesser focused on or ignored?
Well, where to begin? I mean, I think there was some very, very simple reasons why. Actually, I mean, the Wealth of Nations landed at a time when the question of what global trade should be and how it should be organised was absolutely pregnant in everyone's mind, because we're in the process of having the mother of all dust-ups with the American colonies, and we'd come out of a process, and we would design, and we were, as it were, elaborating a trade system based on the 7 Years' War, which Britain was manifestly incapable of affording and having to move beyond. And so, and then within, as it were, enlightened circles, I think there was a sense that they hadn't quite, they hadn't quite nailed it. Now, people were onto something, rather important philosophical category, but they hadn't really nailed it down. And they knew what nailing it down was like, because they'd seen everyone floundering around with cosmology, right? So, Copernicus, amazing, but that's not quite right. And Kepler, amazing, that's not quite right. Tycho Brahe, amazing, that's quite right. Okay. Newton, oh my gosh, are you kidding? I now have a theory which predicts the location of every large body in the universe at any point before or in the past or in the future. It's like, and by the way, all the dynamics have changed. It's like, oh my gosh. So the reaction to the Wealth of Nations was this feeling of kind of gathering together some sense of unresolved activity in a way that gave it incredible power. And indeed, Thomas Pannell referred to it as, the principia of, I think he did, of political economy. Now, in the case of the theory of moral sentiments, I mean, there wasn't a pregnant context like that to fall into. Smith as Luttrell isn't well known. But also there's just the very straightforward point that people aren't really very interested in moral philosophy, and it's not an easy book. It's not an easy book to read. It's actually in many ways a work of moral psychology. I think if Smith were alive today, he'd probably be producing the kind of 40,000 word version and be selling it in vast quantities. It would probably be called something like, glance. I mean, that being, in fact, I should write that book now, right? Glance as opposed to nudge, all of these other things. That being the glance is the kind of moment of one's own recognition of oneself in other people's behaviour, and so, yeah. I mean, Smith also, although a wonderful writer, was in both cases very keen to make sure that whatever the edition was at the time was his final word, and it did evolve in each case, as you may know. So they're weighty books in every sense.
Well, I'm worried it may be more of a personal question than directly upon
Hello.
the works of Adam Smith, but you've mentioned, and obviously just before you came in as well, about the different roles you've been involved in, from energy businesses to pension funds to charities, and I'd really like to know where your interest in Adam Smith peaked, and how you've sort of found yourself acquiring so much knowledge about it.
That's very kind of you to say that. I listen, there are real scholars in the world, and I am not one of them. There are real scholars in this world, and I'm not one of them. But I just get my head under the hood if I possibly can and try and figure out what's going on. And in part it's because, you go through your life thinking, what's really going on here? It's really, and I also, so why did I find myself in finance? Because I hated the idea of anyone lying to me about money. And so you end up kind of getting stuck in that way. But there's also a slightly wider project, which is, it might be worth just sketching. So I think there is a positive value to talking about, in different areas, the people who have set the presuppositions, the intellectual, theoretical presuppositions of how we live now. So Burke does that, as I described, in politics, and Smith does it in political economy. And I've actually just finished a new book on two other people who do this. Francis Bacon, the idea of natural philosophy and science and the empirical turn in science, and Edward Coke, who is a great judge of the early 17th century in our common law constitution. So I don't think those are necessarily people you'll want to have back in Panmure House, but that's the next focus of my interest, if you like.
Thank you very much. We've got a question there and then a question there.
And you mentioned with this increase in supply in the energy market would lead to this glut and eventual glut of supply, which will also probably be met with another glut of demand because of, I guess, exponential consumption.
Of course.
Now, apologies if this is a swear word, but where would you feel Adam Smith would consider the concept of degrowth in this current environment, and would you see it as a fringe economic theory, or would you kind of try and argue against it and break it down into it's kind of fundamentally not fundamentally doesn't work on? Is there a point to it?
But by degrowth you mean, as it were, a deliberate social decision, as it were, to try to maintain a steady state of growth of an economy, or no growth in the economy?
Yeah, reducing consumption, like simultaneously reducing production and consumption.
I mean, I suppose the worry would be that although Smith thinks that commercial society can have aspects that degenerate into materialism, trinkets of frivolous utility and the like, he also thinks that commercial society has been enormously equalizing, empowering, enfranchising, and ultimately of social benefit because it gives people material benefits that they haven't enjoyed before. So I think he'd be quite skeptical about whether, I mean, I'm not even sure I can define what degrowth would be. An economy growing at its inflation rate rather than growing at in minus real terms. I'm not sure he would necessarily have a view as to how that could be achieved. And I'm not sure he would think it'd be a good idea in principle. I think what he might say, and who knows? I mean, it's a parlour game, right, to guess what he might say. But I think what he might say is that the concerns that are being raised by people who are worried about the effects of economic growth may be addressable by other means, or may be allayable in some sense by other means. So there were policy changes you could make that would address sort of the concerns that they've reached. Now, it's an open question whether that strategy works or not, and whether it works in time, given some of the worries that people have about our current way of being. But I'm fairly sure he wouldn't have thought that it was a step forward, a social advance, to move back from commercial society to one that, if you for example said, do you think we should go back to a pastoral society, or an agrarian one? I think he'd be quite hostile to that idea. He'd done quite a lot of, I think he knew what it meant. And of course, don't forget that when he thinks of social development, he doesn't just think of development in economic well-being, he also thinks that your norms and values change. So he would worry about what he would worry about, I guess he would worry about increased brutality, and regression in that sense, as though you might become more warlike, greater competition for resources, those kinds of things.
Great, thank you very much. And I'm conscious we're starting to draw towards a close. So, Graham.
Right. So someone, as I have been involved with Panmure for the last 7 years, and I'm delighted in your enthusiasm for everything.
Graham, I should have mentioned your name. I'm so sorry. Hello. Thank you.
Yeah, and you can answer this question either as Jesse Norman or as Adam Smith. Where would you like to see this project of ours in 5 years' time?
What a fantastic question. I was talking about it with Angus earlier. I think there's an incredible opportunity here for Panmure House to become a kind of beacon for thinking in areas that bear on its own inheritance. And I think there's a really interesting space that would live between the purely academic and the purely policy-oriented, for a non-partisan convening building to be used as the basis for an institution that has a life and an energy that goes way beyond it and potentially around the world. And I think that would be a fantastic thing to do. And investments in this place that make the experience of coming to Panmure House extraordinarily special, and that then become inspirational to other people who go around the world and think about these ideas. And an investment in the academic excellence that undergirds that, as well as the kind of policy relevance, would be incredibly well repaid, I think. And if anyone's minded to support an institution such as Panmure House and this particular institution on that basis, I would thoroughly encourage them to do that.
Thank you for that.
Right. Jesse, thank you very, very much for an absolutely fantastic presentation, and dare I say it, an almost an even better set of discussions that we had. It's a wonderful opportunity to play off of a range of stimulating, challenging, and ultimately diverse questions. I think what it all highlighted for me was the importance of Panmure House as that forum, as that venue where we can start having these types of conversations. Because if I got you correctly quoted, much of our thinking today is nitpicking around the edges of society, and then contrasting that with some of the big ideas, the big thinking that you saw in the Enlightenment. And I think what I see, and I know colleagues in Hereford see, the opportunity for Panmure House. It feels small, it feels in the nascent stages at the moment, but being that sort of place that can take the long-term thinking. It's not just about long-term investment, it's about long-term thinking. If there is going to be a contestation of ideas with China, we need to be having fora, we need to be developing fora, physical and virtual, where we can have the wrestling with these ideas. And I am really delighted that you came along. You were very, very modest in saying you were not a real academic, you were not a real scholar of Adam Smith. I think most of us here would absolutely refute that. And I think what Adam Smith in many ways reflected as somebody living in the Enlightenment was doing multiple things. Smith had so many different roles, he had so many different purposes, and actually stepping away from the segmentation, the segregation between the academy and practice, and bridge it, as you're doing, is hugely, hugely valuable. I think it has underpinned an absolutely fantastic session. So can I ask that we all join together and express our thanks to Jesse for a great evening.